From hosting stylistic matchups from all around the world to finding the best promotional strategy for their fighters, both Bellator and UFC have a lot on their schedule, except that the UFC does much of the same things, but better. At least that's the popular perception. You may have heard the phrase, marketing's all about image building. If you look at the UFC, you can see this principle in action. The promotion does it all, from scouting the best in the business to launching them in big-name events at the biggest venues in Las Vegas, and recently Abu Dhabi. It's a truly global promotion, with Dagestani fighters on its roster and a huge Mexican constituency in its wings. Apart from Olympians and NCAA wrestling veterans, the UFC really goes all in for a mixed martial arts approach.
Double fingers and a fully locked and drop. It is all over! Whoa! Nate Diaz by submission!
Combining and pairing up the most diverse styles, and adding some much-needed buzz with a creative marketing campaign. With 2.4 million pay-per-view buys of the UFC 229 event, its supremacy is undoubted, and Dana White's charismatic leading man image from the front lines makes it a hands-on operation. He takes it seriously, and so does the fighting fraternity. Even legendary coaches like Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov all target this as their ultimate destination. If so many serious, credible people of his caliber regard the promotion so highly, naturally audiences take it seriously too. That's the promotional game in a nutshell. And that's where Bellator's perception as a feeder for the UFC plays a big role. You see, just as the UFC's held up as the ultimate fighting destination, the mecca of martial arts, Bellator is seen as a rest stop on the way to the ultimate destination. Part of this image is the fact that this opinion is technically true. A lot of fighters do make the jump from Bellator to the UFC, and when the fighters for any reason fail to emulate their earlier success, it's seen as a clear sign that the UFC is a much different ballgame, with bigger and better competition than any other promotion. Case in point, Ben Askren. The former Bellator and one welterweight champ was undefeated for 10 years, but Funky didn't even last a year as a contender in the UFC. His record knockout to Jorge Masvidal was held up as proof that the UFC is on a different level entirely. It wasn't always like this though. The UFC owes a big chunk of its present-day clout to Dana White. Since 2001, he's clocked in countless hours to launch the UFC's reality TV show, The Ultimate Fighter, a show that gives audiences a peek at the preparation that goes into a match. I would say it brought a lot of fans even closer to the ground reality and made them almost part of the action itself. This sort of connection and intimacy is absent from Bellator, partly because it's always changing and brimming with exciting upstarts. A lot of them fizzle out after a while, leaving fans with less one-on-one time to follow or track their favorite fighters. On the other hand, UFC fighters seem to have a longer shelf life than Bellator.
He's fighting at range, Arlovsky fires, just misses, and Ngannou comes over the top of the left and boom, beautiful.
It's an older promotion with a richer legacy. It's also the more polished one, with a lot more focus on production value. That can often turn out to be a negative, but in the UFC's case, it saved itself from the WWE-style gimmickry and kept up a sophisticated branding setup that allows the fighters' personalities, backgrounds, and styles to shine through.
All right, Connor, we believe you. It was an absolutely legitimate stoppage. I mean, that was just glorious.
I still remember the promotional stills from Khabib's biggest fights. They were billed keeping some key values in sight: loyalty, family, faith. Emphasizing these core values made the Eagle a new and exciting prospect. On the other hand, when it came to Conor McGregor, he was promoted as a rags-to-riches guy who had made it big. Though what really stood the UFC apart from the more flashy promotional values of Bellator was its smooth integration of it all. To be fair, it had a lot more practice than its rivals. The UFC is one of the oldest kids around the block. It hosted its first event in 1993, compared to Bellator, which burst onto the scene much later. It was formed in 2008 and underwent some big changes early on, including a passing of the mantle from founder Bjorn Rebney to Strikeforce founder Scott Coker, and current boss of the promotion. So by the time Bellator came in, the UFC had already dominated the market. You can imagine its network, distribution, and talent pool was much more diverse worse than the much younger Bellator. As a result, UFC had already laid down a lot of ground rules. For Scott's promotion then, it was a case of playing second fiddle. The turf was already taken, especially after the unified rules of MMA were created in 2000. These standardized procedures were an innovation aimed to streamline the matches and make things even for all. For the promotions themselves though, things were far from even. The UFC had the upper hand, especially since it had more time to perfect and implement these rules into its game plan. It also had much more time than Bellator to modify some rules and experiment with them on a case-by-case basis. I imagine the volume of fights going through the UFC gave them a lot of test runs into what worked and what didn't. This resulted in some slight changes, which can end up creating a very different viewing experience. For example, Bellator has 3 rounds for each fight except for a championship fight. On the other hand, the UFC goes 5 for all of its fights. Some might call this a more level playing field. Others might see it as a violation of the unified rules and a cruel burden for the contenders. The truth is, there are as many opinions on it as there are audiences watching. It all comes down to which one people like most, and I think it's clear that the UFC's the favorite in that arena. As the biggest promotion in the world, its size reflects in its much more nuanced weight divisions. The UFC's proven that in martial arts, a lowest common denominator approach won't survive. In order to cater to the masses, you have to cater your fights to your audience. As such, it has 12 divisions in total and covers every class of fighter from flyweight to heavyweight. This allows for a much greater degree of flexibility than Bellator, which has only 7 divisions for men and just 2 for women. The lack of weight classes in Bellator does mean more one-sided matchups. Even if the fighter styles are unique, the weight classes make it much more taxing on a fighter against a larger opponent. Technically though, both fighters may be regarded in the same division because they share the same weight class. That's a bit of a letdown, because you can't fully explore the fighter's pound-for-pound potential this way. Even if you feel Bellator's weight divisions make for more demanding matchups, it's the women's roster that really disappoints. The 2 women's weight divisions feel like a formality, an afterthought. Compared to the UFC, it's exactly half, which is still much smaller a gap than fighter pay. While there are many other differences between the 2 promotions, one of the most glaring discrepancies is the fighter pay. I know the UFC doesn't have a great public record when it comes to this topic, but the truth is, UFC's topmost fighters earn way more than their peers at Bellator. Not even Fedor Emelianenko could match even average UFC fighters in pay. His $300,000 in wages don't even crack the $1 million range that UFC fighters like Jan Blachowicz earned at their peak. That's without considering the megastars like Conor, who pulled north of $10 million in his heyday. I expect the disparities only increased even further since then, as former champ Ngannou and current champ Jones negotiate bigger contracts. And that's all for why UFC is better than Bellator. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.